November 1975, and Luanda smelled of ocean salt, rotting mangoes, and cheap diesel. The Portuguese Empire, which had spent centuries hemorrhaging the lifeblood of this land, collapsed into dust in a matter of weeks. The port was a scene of unimaginable chaos. Retornados colonial settlers frantically loaded everything of value onto rusting freighters. From antique furniture to dismantled refrigerators, those who couldn't secure spots simply pushed their brand new Peugeots and Fiats off the piers into the murky waters of the Atlantic, ensuring the cars wouldn't fall into the hands of the Marxists. In Langley, this chaos was viewed through a different lens. On the maps at CIA headquarters, Angola looked like a massive limestone rook locking down southern Africa. If Luanda fell to the MPLA movement nurtured on Soviet rations and Lenin's Maxumza, Red Belt would slice the continent in half. For Washington, still reeling from the humiliating flight from Saigon, this was unacceptable. But a Congress spooked by Vietnam syndrome had vetoed any direct military intervention. Thus, Operation IAFEATURE was born. It was a war of shadows, a war where checks from Swiss banks carried more weight than diplomatic notes, and vintage FNFL rifles and Chinese-made AK-47s became the primary arguments in the debate over the future of democracy. Here, among the baobabs and the oil rigs of Cabinda, the logic of the Cold War reached its zenith. Cynical, bloody, and entirely devoid of illusion. In a fourth-floor office at Langley, John Stockwell, a career intelligence officer with the hardened stare of a man who had witnessed too many coups, opened a folder marked Top Secret. Within it lay the fate of a country most Americans had never even heard of. Stockwell knew there were no good guys in this game. There were only corporate interests, logistics chains, and useful bastards willing to burn villages so that Washington could sip its evening bourbon, comforted by the knowledge that containment was working. John Stockwell hated humidity, but in Africa there was no escaping it. It soaked through his Brooks Brothers shirts, made his Pall Malls soft and tasteless, and turned his thoughts sluggish. In July 1975, he was appointed head of the Angola task force. The mission was stated with clinical clarity: prevent Agostinho Neto and his MPLA movement from taking power. We need our own son of a bitch, John, his handler told him, sipping an iced tonic. Preferably one who knows how to shoot and can talk about freedom in 3 languages. That man was Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA. Savimbi was the ultimate African political chameleon, a giant of a man with a dazzling smile and the eyes of a fanatic. He had once trained in China in the methods of Maoist guerrilla warfare, but he was quick to sense which way the wind was blowing. He swapped Mao's Little Red Book for anti-communist rhetoric the moment he caught the scent of American dollars. To the CIA, he was the perfect instrument for a proxy war. The first tranches of cash flowed through Kinshasa, the capital of Zaire. President Mobutu Sese Seko Aman, known for his leopard skin hats and European bank accounts, readily agreed to act as the middleman. Zaire became a gargantuan staging ground. At remote jungle airstrips, unmarked C-130 transports touched down under the cover of night. Their holds didn't contain medicine. They were packed with crates of brand new American M16 rifles, law rocket launchers, and millions in untraceable cash. Stockwell personally oversaw the logistics. He watched as black operations turned into a bureaucratic conveyor belt. We bought the loyalty of tribal chiefs as mundanly as one orders paperclips. He would later recall, $1 million for Savimbi's expenses, $2 million for Holden Roberto of the F, and another $500,000 for Mobutu as a transit fee. Meanwhile, in Luanda, Agostinho Neto, a poet with the mannerisms of a university professor, was fortifying his defenses. He knew his militiamen couldn't hold out against the South African armored cars already probing Angola's southern borders. In August 1975, in Havana, Fidel Castro made a decision that would alter the course of history. He dispatched the first military advisors to Angola. Behind them came Soviet ships laden with T-54 tanks and Grad rocket launchers. The CIA station in Kinshasa worked 24/7s. Encrypted cables flew to Langley in rapid succession. Cubans arriving, beaches under MPLA control, Savimbi demanding more heavy weaponry. He posed for photographers in fatigues, a gold-tipped swagger stick in hand, promising to liberate the people from the Red Plague. His fighters, many of whom had been behind a plow just yesterday, now gripped sophisticated Western weaponry. They didn't care for ideology. They knew that UNITA meant food, a uniform, and the right to pillage those who supported NATO. The first major clash occurred when UNITA Kalumas, supported by South African instructors, attempted to break through to the capital. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke and heated metal. South African Eland armored cars plowed through the red dust of the savannah, advancing under artillery cover. But blocking their path were not mere rebels, but regular Cuban units. It was then that Stockwell began to realize they were being sucked into something far vaster than a quick police action. This wasn't a counterinsurgency. This was a full-scale war, where Angola was merely the backdrop for a global showdown between superpowers. "We were creating a monster," Stockwell wrote in his journal. "We gave Savimbi the money and the guns, knowing he would unstop until he turned the country into a graveyard. But at that moment, we only cared about the statistics. How many Cubans killed? How many kilometers of territory seized?" By November, when the Portuguese flag was finally lowered over the Fortaleza de São Miguel in Luanda, Angola was already torn to pieces. The city was under siege, water was rationed, and the power grid flickered and died. In the darkened offices of Langley and the Kremlin, officials moved pins across maps, deaf to the screams of those dying under the fire of grads and American mortars. Operation IAFEATURE had entered its most active phase. European mercenaries, catching the scent of easy money and blood, were already packing their bags in Brussels and London. The wild geese were preparing for flight, and Stockwell, staring at satellite photos of burning Angolan villages, felt the first cold prickle of doubt. Was this piece of scorched earth really worth the price the world was about to pay? But the abort order never came. On the contrary, a new directive arrived from Washington. Increase shipments. Do not let the front collapse at any cost. The proxy war had only just begun. By early 1976, the CIA's secret operation, IAFEATURE, had mutated into a logistical nightmare hidden behind a facade of humanitarian aid. In Kinshasa, under the shadow of Mobutu's palatial residence, John Stockwell watched as the noble goals of defending democracy finally dissolved into corruption and blood. The Ngili airfield in Zaire was operating at its breaking point. Every night, heavy Boeing 707s and unmarked C-130s touched down. On the fuselages of some, the emblems of fictional, charitable organizations had been hastily painted. But instead of powdered milk and bandages, there holds disgorged crates of tow, anti-tank missile, recoilless reefless, and tons of 7.62 millimeters ammunition. This isn't logistics. It's magic, one case officer quipped cynically, marking the incoming cargo in the ledger as agricultural equipment. The problem was that modern weaponry in the hands of UNITA rebels was little more than useless scrap metal. Savimbi's boys knew how to pull a trigger, but they had no grasp of ballistics or unit tactics. The South African advisors from the SADF, South African Defense Force, were reluctant to engage in direct combat, fearing an international scandal. Washington needed meat with combat experienced-men who, officially, had no ties to the Pentagon. This was how the wild geese appeared in Angola. Recruitment took place through front companies in London, Brussels, and Johannesburg. The newspaper ads were terse. Men with military experience sought for security work in Africa. High pay, no insurance provided. The call was answered by those for whom war had become the only trade. Vietnam veterans, former French Foreign Legion paratroopers, and garden variety adventurers seeking a hit of adrenaline and a stack of banknotes. One of the most notorious figures was Costas Georgiou, better known as Colonel Kayan, a former British paratrooper with sadistic tendencies. He arrived in Angola leading a group of mercenaries armed to the teeth and utterly devoid of moral compasses. Callan and his men favored FNFAL rifles and smoked nothing but senior service, leaving behind mountains of cigarette butts and charred villages. Stockwell met them in the bars of The air in these joints was heavy with camel smoke, the scent of sweat, and cheap Primus beer. The mercenaries discussed contracts, cleaned their Brownings right on the tables, and bragged about how many Terry Zempalot terrorists they had bagged that week. "These men are uncontrollable psychopaths," Stockwell reported back to Langley. "They are discrediting everything we are trying to build. They shoot their own recruits for the slightest infraction." The response from headquarters was dry. We need results. UNITA must hold the ports and airfields, provide the mercenaries with whatever they need. Dirty logistics also involved complex financial schemes. CIA money, the black funds that were not accountable to Congress, was laundered through a network of shell companies in the Bahamas. Stockwell saw millions of dollars vanish into the pockets of middlemen. Mobutu Sese Seko took his tithe for every plane that landed in his country. Savimbi demanded more and more cash, claiming he needed to feed his army, though his soldiers often ate whatever they could pillage from the peasantry. Meanwhile, the Cuban contingent of Operation Carlotta was growing exponentially. In the port of Luanda, Soviet freighters were offloading BRDM to South and BM-21 Grad rocket launches. The regular Cuban units, unlike the mercenaries, possessed iron discipline and ideological fervor. They weren't fighting for money. They were fighting for the world revolution, which made them lethally dangerous adversaries. In February 1976, the Northern Front collapsed. Colon's group, demoralized and out of touch with command, began a chaotic retreat. In a fit of paranoia, Kalin himself ordered the execution of 14 of his own men, accusing them of cowardice. It was the end of the myth of the invincible white mercenary. When Kalin was later captured, tried in Luanda, and executed by firing squad, it served as a massive propaganda blow to the United States. Stockwell stood on the balcony of his residence, watching the setting sun turn the Congo River the color of clotted blood. It realized the black operations had failed. Instead of surgical influence, they had midwifed an endless slaughter. Instead of containment, they had invited the full-scale presence of the Eastern Bloc. "We are feeding a war that will consume us all," he told his assistant, crushing a cigarette into an ashtray full of gray ash. But the machine was already in motion. Jonas Savimbi, sensing the north was lost, withdrew his main forces to the south, into the impenetrable jungles and savannas of Cuando-Cabango province. There, in a place called Jamba, he began to build his state within a state. The CIA continued the shipments, now primarily through South Africa. The proxy war had shifted into a war of attrition, where the primary currency was no longer dollars, but human lives thrown into the furnace of geopolitical ambition. Stockwell began drafting his first report of disillusionment. He did not yet know that ahead lay Cuito Cuanavale. Cuito Cuanavale, tank battle on the continent, which would come to be known as Africa's Stalingrad. By the mid-1980s, Angola had transformed into a gargantuan testing ground for the world's newest weapon systems. The savannah, once the domain of lions and elephants, was now scarred by deep ruts from Soviet T-62 tanks and South African Radel-armored vehicles. In Langley, Stockwell was no longer the man. In charge, the operation was now run by men who slipped Africa through the cold mathematics of attrition. Cuito Cuanavale, the name of this small, God-forsaken town in the southeast, would soon be etched into the annals of military history. Prelude to the slaughter in 1987, the MPLA government forces FAPLA, backed by Soviet generals, decided to deliver a knockout blow to the Beast Lair Savimbi's headquarters in Jamba. It was dubbed Operation Saludando Octubre, greeting October. The plan was grand. A massive armored fist intended to crush UNITA once and for all. But Pretoria could not allow its buffer zone to fall. The South African Defense Force, ZDF, launched Operation Modular. The air over Cuando-Cabango province vibrated with the roar of turbines. South African Mirages and Impalas engaged in lethal dogfights with Angolan MiG-23SA, often piloted by Cuban aces. The thunder of the G5 guns. The battle for Cuito Cuanavale did not begin with a tank charge, but with a hellish symphonic orchestra of artillery. South Africa deployed its secret weapon, the 155mm C5 howitzer. These monsters, the brainchild of the Canadian engineering genius Gerald Bull, could hurl shells 40 kilometers with surgical precision. It wasn't just a bombardment. It was the sterilization of the landscape. Survivors from FAPLA later recalled, "You don't hear the shot. You just see the bunker next to you turn into dust, along with the men inside." G5 shells tore through the air, obliterating Soviet-supplied logistical columns. The smell of burnt rubber, diesel, and vaporized blood became a permanent fixture of the region. the steel deadlock in early 1988, the battle reached its zenith. The Cubans, realizing their Angolan allies were wavering, threw elite units into the fray under the command of General Arnaldo Ochoa. For the first time in African history, regular armies clashed head-on, using hundreds of armored units. The fields around the Lamba River became a graveyard of scorched metal. Soviet T-55s and T-62s blundered into minefields, becoming easy prey for UNITA anti-tank teams armed with American Milan missiles. South African Oliphant tanks modernized. British Centurions moved slowly through the bush, engaging in duels at distances that seemed impossible for the jungle. In the command centers of Luanda and Pretoria, the maps were covered in marks until no white space remained. But on the ground, the situation ground to a halt. Every inch of soil was soaked in diesel and littered with spent casings. South Africa could not take Cuito Cuanavale without incurring casualties that would be unacceptable to the white electorate back home. And the Cubans could not push the enemy any further back into the desert. A cynical tally, John Stockwell, observing from across the ocean, saw only the confirmation of his worst fears. Africa's Stalingrad produced no victor on the battlefield. It was a stalemate paid for with the lives of thousands of Angolans who were used as mere pawns. While diplomats in New York and Geneva smoked dunghills and argued over borders, doctors in the field hospitals of Cuito Cuanavale were performing amputations without anesthesia. Soviet advisors drank industrial alcohol, trying to drown out the screams of young men burning alive inside their tanks. South African conscript farmers wrote home on bloodstained stationery, struggling to understand why they were dying thousands of miles from Cape Town. The Battle of Cuito Cuanavale marked the end of an era. It proved that there was no military solution to the conflict. It was here that the spine of South Africa's white fortress began to crack, and the Soviet Union realized that its African adventure was becoming too expensive to sustain. But Jonas Savimbi, hidden in his forest citadel, had no intention of surrender. For him, the war was only beginning. He cared nothing for global geopolitics. He wanted absolute power over the country, even if that country became a scorched wasteland. The early 1990s brought the scent of change to the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of apartheid in South Africa, and the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Africa. It seemed the Cold War had ended, and Angola, exhausted by decades of slaughter, could finally breathe. In 1992, under pressure from the international community, the first free elections were scheduled. But Jonas Savimbi was not built for peace. He arrived in Luanda like a conqueror. He was surrounded by bodyguards in lizard camouflage carrying Israeli Uzi submachine guns, his famous smile beaming a smile that masked the instincts of a predator. Washington, which had once pumped him full of weapons, now sent polite observers in suits that smelled of expensive cologne. Savimbi believed that he was Angola, a former CIA station officer recalled. When the election results showed him losing to Agostinho Neto and his successor, José Eduardo dos Santos, he simply couldn't accept it. Democracy, to him, was just another black op that hadn't gone according to plan. Return to the source. Savimbi declared the results fraudulent, while diplomats at UN headquarters frantically shuffled papers. The Black Panther issued the order that plunged the country into its bloodiest chapter yet. UNITA returned to the bush. Cities that had only just begun to rebuild shuddered under explosions once again. Savimbi changed his tactics. This was no longer a war of ideologies. It was a war for resources. He seized control of the diamond mines in Lunda Norte province. Blood diamonds became UNITA's new currency, replacing American grants. In the black markets of Antwerp and Tel Aviv, raw stones pulled from Angolan mud were transformed into brand new shipments of Strelaman pads and tons of explosives. A landscape of minefields. Angola became a nation of invalids. Savimbi made landmines his primary strategic tool. His men planted the earth with Black Widows, anti-personnel mines of Soviet, Italian, and American origin as thickly as peasants plant corn. The mines were everywhere. Around wells, on paths to schools, in rice paddies. Death was cheaper Chinese type. 72 mine cost less than $3. But clearing it costs thousands. Angola became the world leader in the number of amputees. Men and children on crutches lined the roads, a living reminder of what happens when a leader does not know how to lose. John Stockwell, who by then had fully broken with the agency and authored In Search of Enemies, noted with bitter, "We raised a man who could not exist outside the context of war. We gave him the tools to destroy, but forgot to teach him how to build. Now he is burning the country down simply because it is the only thing he truly knows how to do." The hunt for a ghost. By the late 90s, Savimbi had become a cornered beast. His former patrons in Washington had turned their backs on him with the end of the standoff with the US. He had become an inconvenient asset. Government forces, now trained by Western and Russian private military contractors, including the infamous executive outcomes, began to systematically tighten the noose. Savimbi drifted from one forest camp to another. His radio stations broadcast pathetic speeches about resisting colonizers, but his army was melting away. Soldiers deserted, tired of the endless flight through the bush. His only companions were his personal guard and his paranoia. He began executing his own officers at the slightest suspicion of betrayal, burning their families on pyres, old habits of his Maoist past resurfacing. The final act of the drama played out on February 22nd, 2002. In Moxeco province, among the thick brush, FAPLA Special Forces caught up with Savimbi's unit. The 67-year-old man fought to the end. 15 bullets were later found in his body. In the pocket of his uniform lay a gold pistol, a gift from a fellow dictator, and a vial of French perfume. With Savimbi's death, the war that had lasted 27 years ceased almost instantly. It turned out the only obstacle to peace had been the ambition of one man whom Langley had once called the hope of democracy in Africa. Angola went still. The smoke from the fires began to clear, revealing a mangled land where there were 10,000 mines for every kilometer of road, and over 500,000 dead lay in the earth. Operation IAFEATURE had officially ended long ago, but its echo continued to ring in every click of a crutch against the asphalt of Luanda. When Jonas Savimbi's body was put on public display in 2002, propped against a tree for the world's media cameras, the world felt a strange sensation, a mixture of relief and revulsion. The era of great leaders and proxy wars had ended, giving way to the era of big money. By then, John Stockwell had long since retired, watching the results of his handiwork from the quiet of America. Had he returned to Luanda today, he would not recognize the city. On the marginal embankment, where the Portuguese once drowned their Peugeots, skyscrapers of glass and steel now rise, their costs rivaling the office towers of Dubai. The glitter of Cabinda and the misery of the museum. Modern Angola is a country of the most jarring inequality on the planet. The oil of the Cabinda Shelf, over which the CIA and KGB once moved tank divisions, now flows through pipelines into the tankers of ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Total. The country pumps over 1.5 million barrels of black gold every day. But the logic of containment has been replaced by the logic of extraction. Oil revenues settle in the hands of a thin layer of the elite, grown from the upper echelons of the MPLA. Luanda has officially been ranked as one of the most expensive cities in the world for expats. Here, a cup of coffee in a guarded business center can cost $10, while 500 meters away, in the Musex, the slums people live on less than $2 a day. We won the war, say the officials in Zegna suits, sipping champagne in clubs on the Ilha de Luanda. We survived the war, echo the amputees on crutches, begging for alms at the feet of those very clubs. Ghosts in the dirt, the minefields that Savimbi so carefully cultivated have not gone anywhere. Despite the work of international foundations and the high-profile campaigns of Princess Diana, and later Prince Harry, the Angolan soil still guards millions of black widows. The maps of minefields drawn up by Soviet advisors and South African engineers often prove useless. Decades of tropical rains have shifted the lethal plastic and metal beneath the topsoil. Agriculture, which could have fed all of southern Africa, remains paralyzed. Peasants are terrified to step into the fields. As a result, Angola, land of immense fertility, imports the majority of its food, paying for it with petrol. The tally of Operation IAFEATURE. Looking at the results of Operation IAFEATURE, 30 years after its formal conclusion. A cynical conclusion is inescapable. Washington succeeded in preventing a red belt, but the price of that success was catastrophic. Geopolitics. The proxy war turned Angola into ruins, but allowed the US to exhaust the resources of the USSR and Cuba on the periphery. Economics. Resource nationalism won. Oil giants work with the former Marxists, just as effectively as they would have worked with Savimbi. Money smells neither of gunpowder nor of ideology. Human capital. Angola maintains one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. 1 in 5 children here does not live to see their 5th birthday. This is the true statistic that the disillusioned Stockwell once warned about. Epilogue. In the jungles of Moxico province, the site of Savimbi's death is slowly being reclaimed by the greenery. The iron skeletons of Oliphant and T-54 tanks near Cuito Cuanavale slowly rust, turning into grotesque monuments to the madness of the 20th century. The Cold War left behind a scorched earth, but life continues. In the port of Luanda, the air still smells of salt and diesel. Only now, they aren't loading the antique furniture of refugees, but containers of electronics and Chinese consumer goods. The pieces on the chessboard have changed, but the rules of the game remain the same. The big players call the match, and the bill is paid by those who never held a knight in their hand. The story of Operation IAFEATURE is not a story of the victory of democracy or the triumph of socialism. It is a chronicle of how the cynical logic of containment transformed a living country into a statistical margin of error on the maps of general staffs.